My name is Allison Furlan, and today I'll be presenting my project on heat vulnerability patterns across Nueces County, Texas. Using GIS and spatial statistics, this project combines land cover and population data to identify areas where higher heat exposure and population density overlap, and to evaluate whether those patterns are spatially clustered. The study area, as mentioned, is Nueces County, Texas, located along the Gulf Coast in South Texas. It includes the urban core of Corpus Christi, as well as suburban, industrial, agricultural, and coastal areas, creating variation in land cover and population patterns that influence heat exposure. The two primary data sets that were used is the National Land Cover Database, raster data to represent land cover and estimate relative heat exposure, and the ACS population data to calculate census tract level population density. Census tract was served as the main spatial unit for this analysis. And the methods to start was the reclassification of the National Land Cover Database land cover classes into a 5-level heat exposure scale based on relative heat retention. So things like water, wetlands, and vegetated areas received lower values, while highly developed areas received higher values due to greater impervious surface coverage and reduced vegetation. Population density was calculated by dividing census tract population by land area in square kilometers. The mean heat exposure was then calculated for each tract using zonal statistics as table. Then these values were combined with the population density to create a composite vulnerability index, where areas with both higher heat exposure and higher population density received higher vulnerability scores, as you can see in this bottom image here. Finally, the Global Moran's I and JEDIS or GI star were applied to the vulnerability index to evaluate spatial autocorrelation and identify statistically significant hotspots using nearest neighbor definitions of k equals 6, 8, and 10. The results for the vulnerability index revealed strong spatial variation throughout Nueces County. The highest vulnerability values were concentrated within the urban core of Corpus Christi, where higher population density coincided with developed land cover and increased heat exposure potential. In contrast, the rural and peripheral regions generally exhibited lower vulnerability values due to the lower population density and reduced urban development intensity. Global Moran's I was then applied to the vulnerability index map. Across all neighborhood definitions tested, Moran's I values range from approximately 0.58 to 0.66, with z-scores exceeding 13 and p-values below 0.001. These results indicate strong positive spatial autocorrelation, meaning that similar vulnerability values tend to cluster together spatially rather than occurring randomly. JEDIS or GI star analysis was then conducted to identify statistically significant local clusters of elevated vulnerability. Hotspots were concentrated primarily within the urbanized portions of Corpus Christi, while the cold spots dominated the western and peripheral regions. And as the neighborhood size increased from k equals 6 to k equals 10, k equals 6 is at the top and k equals 10 is at the bottom, the clustering patterns became more spatially generalized, and we can see that some of the census tract transformations either becoming more statistically significant as a cold spot, hot spot, or even becoming not significant as that definition was increased. But overall, spatial distribution remained relatively consistent. In conclusion, this project showed that heat vulnerability in Nueces County is spatially clustered and closely linked to urban development and population density. Both of the methods used were useful for identifying overall cluster patterns and localized hotspots. These methods can support future planning for heat resilience and environmental vulnerability in growing urban areas. Some of the limitations include using land cover as a proxy for heat exposure rather than using direct temperature values. And then future assessments could also be improved by including additional socioeconomic variables. So that is my presentation. Thank you for listening, and everybody have a great summer.